Well, we're looking forward to our session this evening, Modelling Movement in Roman Britain. And this is by Chris Green. Now, Chris has been, since 2011, a postdoctoral researcher in GIS, Geography Information Systems, at the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford. And he studied archaeology as an undergraduate at Durham in the late 1990s. And then he took an MSc in GIS at Leicester, followed by a PhD on the applications of temporal GIS to archaeology, also in Leicester. He's worked on a number of projects, most notably the ERC-funded English Landscapes and Identities project at Oxford, under the leadership of Professor Chris Gosden. He currently works on the Leverhulme-funded Ebb and Flow project, which seeks to understand the role of rivers in British later prehistory. Chris is an expert in GIS, Geographic Information Systems, in spatial analysis and data wrangling. He's described himself as a large data set collider, which does make it sound as if he ought to be buried somewhere under the Franco-Swiss border, but I'm sure that's not the case. Much of his work involves the collation and synthesis of big data sets. Well, I am left in awe at all of that. Very much looking forward to what Chris has to say tonight. You are bound to have questions you want to put to him, and Chris has kindly agreed to answer some questions at the end of the presentation this evening. So if you could reserve the chat function for that, just put in the questions as they occur to you, with as much information as you think they need, so that we know which bit of the lecture it was about, and we'll put those to Chris at the end of the evening. So, Chris, over to you. We are very much looking forward to it.
Okay, I'll share my screen and then you can let me know if it's working. Can you all see that?
Yes, indeed, that's fine.
Great. Okay, cool. Great. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation, and Rob for the introduction. As stated, I'm Chris Green, and I was a postdoctoral researcher on the English Landscapes and Identities project, which was at Oxford, which the short term for was EngLaId. So when I'm talking about EngLaId all evening, that's what I'm talking about. And I'm here to talk to you today about how we approach modelling movement, as movement is the fundamental role of roads, and you are the Roman Roads Research Association. On the talk, we've also, it's sort of a cooperation between myself and Tyler Franconi, who he's now at Brown University on the east coast of the US and is very busy with teaching. So I'm doing the talk, but it's our work together. All right, to start with a little bit of a plug, the two main outputs of the project came out last year in the form of these two books. The main monograph on the left was published by OUP and includes a chapter on movement written by myself and Tyler, which can also be read at the link on screen if you have access to Oxford Scholarship Online, which would probably involve, if you are a member of an institution, you might have access to that, I don't know. And that chapter is going to form the basis of my talk today. The book on the right was aimed at a wider audience than the sort of more strictly scholarly audience of the main monograph, and was a collaboration between myself and our project artist, Miranda Creswell. And that book you can read for free as a PDF. If you go to the ArchaeoPress web shop, you can just download it. And it has lots of pretty maps and pictures in it. So it's worth a look, even if I say so myself. Okay, EngLaId then, as stated, was an European Research Council funded project that ran from 2011 to 2016 under the direction of Chris Gosden in Oxford. Basically consisted of a national level survey that relied upon data that was already in existence but not synthesized, that had been gathered by a whole series of organizations and individuals that I'll go through on the next slide. It also consisted of a series of 14 case studies, which function more as sort of points of focus for specific elements of the project than as areas subject to specific separate like case study reports. And you can see that they're the areas highlighted in red on the map. And the concept of EngLaId was basically to consider the landscape of England over the very long term, from the Middle Bronze Age, which began around 1500 BC, to the Domesday survey of AD 1086. The Middle Bronze Age was chosen as the starting point, as this was the first time that large-scale field systems were laid out in the English landscape. And Domesday Book was chosen as the end point, as it was the first known comprehensive survey of the state of the English landscape, well, that survived to us at least, albeit one with considerable compromises and inconsistencies. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the Roman period fits within this span of time. We chose, well, the choice was made before I was involved in the project, but England was chosen as the main unit of analysis, as the project was initially focused upon drawing from Historic England's National Mapping Programme, which they've recently made available for anyone to explore online on their Aerial Archaeology Mapping Explorer website, which is quite cool because up until that was launched, there were only a couple of us in the country who could even look at this on a national scale, and it's a brilliant data set. It was also felt that integrating data in addition from Wales and Scotland, which would have produced a more historically coherent spatial unit, would simply have been too much work with the resources available to us. With hindsight, this might have been a mistake, and we could at least have integrated the Welsh data without too much effort, but then one has to draw limits somewhere. So the project was conducted by a team of 10, including Chris Gosden. There were 3 positions for postdoctoral researchers. Tyler replaced Zena Kamash about halfway through the project when she moved to a new post in London at Royal Holloway. And then 3 of the postdocs had period foci. So there was Anwin, the prehistorian, Zena, and then Tyler, the Romanist, and Letty ten Harkel, who studied the early medieval period. And then 1 postdoc with a sort of GIS and data remit, which was me. We also had 3 doctoral students, an administrator, and as mentioned earlier, Miranda, our project artist. The work presented today was primarily conducted by myself and Tyler, as I said, but there was always also input and discussion with all of the other project members on all of the elements of the project. I've also listed here the data sets we collated for the project. The bulk of our data came from local authority historic environment records, of which there are around 80 in England, and the Portable Antiquities Scheme. The other major source of data was Historic England's National Record of the Historic Environment, that used to be known as the National Monuments Record, the NMR. Since we finished, the NRHE has been mothballed and is in the process of being integrated into the local HERs, which should make projects like EngLaId somewhat easier in future for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. The other data sets listed that you can read on screen were smaller scale or sort of ancillary to the main database, so I'm not going to go through them individually here. Just as a sort of general point of interest, the unintegrated nature of the English archaeological record means that when one tries to do a national scale synthesis project, one currently has to approach every data holder individually and ask them for their dataset. So from sending out initial data requests in January 2012, with the bulk of requests going out in March of that year, it took us actually around 18 months to gather in all of the HER data for England for our time period of interest. We still missed out on a couple of smaller HERs, but those gaps were covered at least in part by the NRHE and some of the other data sets. I should also note that as our data collation was largely completed by 2014, the EngLaId database is already, 8 years out of date pretty much, as it's a static snapshot of the state of the English archaeological record at the time of our data capture. If English archaeology had more sort of joined up data architectures, linked data and that sort of thing, this type of work would be much easier, as would keeping data more up to date. As a second sort of general point of interest, I also want to briefly mention why EngLaId occurred when it did, and why we also saw several other synthesis projects come into being around the same time. Probably most notably, particularly in light of the audience today, the Rural Settlement of Roman Britain project at Reading, RSRB for short. As I expect many of you, most of you, all of you are well aware, most archaeological fieldwork in England used to be conducted either on a research basis or as quite poorly funded rescue digs prior to the destruction of archaeology during development. However, in 1990, new rules came in that forced developers to pay for archaeological investigation prior to any potentially destructive development, the famous Planning Policy Guidance Note 16, PPG 16. This resulted in a massive increase in the amount of archaeological fieldwork taking place in England, resulting in the discovery of thousands upon thousands of new sites. Basic information on these sites made its way over time into HERs and other records to be used as the basis for making future planning decisions. The maps on screen show the number of excavations recorded for 3 time slices, so the 50s and the 60s, 70s and the 80s, and then the post-PPG 16, 90s and 2000s, noughties, that are recorded within Historic England's excavation index. And I think this really illustrates this explosion in the amount of fieldwork undertaken. Although you can also see that there is a clear bias in the areas of the country which see more fieldwork, because there's clearly less in sort of upland areas of the north and the west, because people are building less housing estates and that sort of thing, gravel pits and so on. However, this immense mass of new data has been very hard to integrate into synthetic research due to its fractured nature and the simple fact that most detail on sites exists only in paper or PDF reports. Projects like EngLaId and RSRB can be seen as initial attempts to make sense of all this material, to see how the picture painted by English archaeological remains had changed after a couple of decades of developer funding, now 30 years, but you know, at the time it was just over 20. Effectively, there are sort of 2 levels to this data. The high-level HER records that record what was found where, i.e. primarily locations, site types and periods with variable levels of detail. And then there's this sort of vast amount of detailed data hidden away in the actual reports for each site, what one might term the low-level archaeological record. And a lot of that is just in PDFs on either on the ADS or, particularly for older projects, they might just be on paper records stored in a HER somewhere. So the Rural Settlement of Roman Britain project spent a similar amount of time to EngLaId with a similar number of postdocs working on this kind of low-level data, which resulted in a highly detailed and frankly brilliant database relating to around 4,000 rural Roman settlements. However, by working with the low-level material, they only had the resources to look at a fraction of the sites discovered since 1990, basically those that were excavated in detail of one specific site type category, because it just takes a lot of work to go through PDFs and extract information. By contrast, EngLaId approached the sort of high-level archaeological record, resulting in a database which contained over 800,000 useful records, which can be seen here drawn as coloured dots on the map. Clearly, we're comparing 2 different things here, with RSRB only covering one particular category of sites for one time period, but the contrast remains worth highlighting. Detailed assemblage-focused work, such as that undertaken by RSRB, could not easily be undertaken using the EngLaId data. But likewise, the RSRB data couldn't be employed as usefully to consider broad-scale patterning in the ways that the EngLaId database enabled us to do. Just to comment, the dots in the sea are a mixture of things picked up by trawlers, which only certain coastal HERs record, and some things with sort of dodgy grid coordinates. Hopefully the potential of the EngLaId database should be apparent from just how densely populated this map is, where there are very few areas where you can see through to the background. The background is light grey, and I mean, you basically can't see it anywhere. England has a lot of archaeology. However, making sense of all this complexity wasn't straightforward. The main reason for this, or the main reason why it was more complicated than one might imagine, is the varied levels to which the data sets we used were incorporated with each other. We conducted an exercise on a series of 10 by 10 kilometre test squares to examine the degrees to which national level data sets, such as the NRHE or the Portable Antiquities Scheme, PAS, were integrated into the local level HERs, which we considered our primary record. This was done by manual map overlay and comparison, a task that couldn't be conducted for the entire data set within the time and personnel constraints of the project. We found that NRHE could be anything from around 30 to 90% integrated into HERs, being mostly in the vicinity of 50 to 80%. The PAS was mostly unintegrated, but some HERs did integrate that data too. So these are the top and the bottom box plots you can see on the slide. Hopefully this situation will improve, like I say, because NRHE has been mothballed and is in the process of being fully integrated into HERs, but the state of play 10 years ago was not that. So as such, we couldn't extract patterns from the raw data due to the double or more counting of some sites. But we also couldn't manually go through and collapse these overlapping records together, as we'd still be working on that now. We also didn't want to rely purely on the HER records, as the NRHE in particular contained many sites that were not recorded on a local level, largely ones discovered a long time ago or through HE-specific projects. Therefore, we decided we needed to simplify our data using a tessellation of spatial bins. Basically, one first simplifies the terms used for site types and periods down to a set of terms agreed within the project. And then one queries all of the input data sets on a presence/absence basis across a series of spatial bins, producing a synthesized output that records the presence of site types across the area of interest, in this case being England. So on the little example at the bottom of the screen, the spatial bins used are squares, but it doesn't have to be squares, just needs to be a shape that tessellates. So we did this at 3 different scales. We used 1 by 1 kilometre grid squares as the basis for all of our statistical analyses, and as the input data for the various further models produced, many of which I'll get onto later. And then we used 2 sizes of hexagons for production of mapped outputs. Visually, hexagons are more useful than squares, as square gridded outputs can result in readers seeing false horizontal and vertical alignments, simply due to the way the human brain works. And there's less problems with that with hexagons, basically. The 3 kilometre width hexagons, like you can see on the map on the screen, were used for most of our mapped outputs, and the 5 kilometre hexagons were only used for some very broad brush mapping, like the maps of events that I showed earlier. Clearly, there are downsides to this approach, as some detail is lost, but for the high-level analyses that formed our national survey, the benefits outweighed the problems. The majority of the work discussed in the rest of this talk was conducted using these synthetic data layers that summarise the more detailed data within the main project database. So that was kind of the background to the EngLaId project that I thought I needed to cover before we got onto the specifics of how we came to look at movement in particular. And some of this that follows might be quite technical, and I apologise for that, but I'm a technical person, and that's how these things come out. So I wanted to then consider I want to now move on to consider how one can then use this kind of data set to consider questions around movement. Movement is fundamental to human society and economy, so it's one of the major themes we wish to explore. Without movement of people, we'd see no movement of material culture, no movement of ideas, which would make society very insular and much poorer than in reality. A starting position in this began with ways of modelling movement that are commonly employed in GIS, Geographic Information System. This is most commonly done using cost surfaces and least cost paths. In this form of analysis, one takes a landscape and applies a cost factor to moving across it, and one can then calculate the cumulative cost of moving across this landscape to or from a specific point within it, and can then use this to calculate the cheapest path across the landscape from any starting point. That's the least cost path. The scanned image at the top left provides a visual metaphor for this type of analysis, and the map at the top right shows an example of a cost surface derived from elevation data. The four grids at the bottom show a sort of worked example. So from left to right, the first is a cost allocation surface. So this is how much it costs to cross each cell. The second is a cost surface leading to the red X that's cell in the top right, which shows the cumulative cost of moving from any cell to that final cell. With the arrows, the little yellow arrows showing the cheapest route from cell to cell. And then the final two examples show cost paths generated based on that cost surface from the bottom left and top left corners to the top right corner, effectively. Okay. Probably the most commonly applied method for cost surface generation in archaeology uses the formula defined by the great Waldo Tobler, who is known as the godfather of spatial analysis, in 1993. This records the speed at which one can move across a landscape dependent upon the amount of ascent or descent undertaken. This is usually applied using a calculation of the slope of the ground surface. Slight downhill slopes are the fastest traversed, with steep uphill and downhill slopes being more costly. Tobler took his statistics from a much older book by a guy called Imhoff, published in 1950, which basically just gave some rather coarse estimates for how long it took Austrian Jaeger commando troops to move through the Alps. As such, clearly these aren't estimates that would apply very readily to those of us who don't spend all day running up and down alpine landscapes, but they remain the most widely used statistics applied to cost surface analysis in archaeology. Primarily, cost surface analysis in archaeology consists of researchers calculating the least cost paths between sites based on the slope of the ground surface, as if they were Austrian Jaeger commandos. Clearly, this is in some ways very reductive, which it results in singular paths based upon only one aspect of terrain accessibility. As such, we wanted to do something different. Pour myself some more water. Okay, so least cost paths, as I said, provide a single route from one point to another, but the underlying cost surface used to generate them also contains a wealth of useful data. People don't always travel by the cheapest route available to them in terms of energy, and assessing the cheapest route on the ground when walking isn't often easy. When one looks at a hill, can one immediately tell what route up is easiest? Maybe if you're a very experienced hill walker, but I don't think most of us can. As such, assessing tendencies using surfaces rather than specific routes can be more interpretatively useful, if less initially straightforward to understand. We were also interested in understanding general tendencies across the landscape rather than in relation to one specific end or start point. So we approached our analyses using cumulative cost surfaces. So basically, this is where one generates a cost surface for each of a series of points, in this case, the centroid points of our 5 kilometer width hexagonal grid, and then sums the resulting surfaces to produce a cumulative or everywhere to everywhere cost surface. One of the problems with this method is that the greater density of points in the center of the study region and the fact that all long distance routes need to pass through the center results in a very pronounced edge effect, where peripheral regions show much higher cumulative costs than central regions. The example on the left shows such a surface. To compensate for this, we constructed another cumulative cost surface, showing on the right, where every cell of the grid had an equal cost. So this flat cost surface can then be used to normalize through subtraction the variable cost surface and reduce the edge effects dramatically, as you'll see in the following models. Just to note, the other problem with this method is that these type of models are very intensive to process. On the computer I was using at the time, they took anything from 12 hours to 3 days to run, depending on the resolution of the cost allocation services. So, to move on to the meat of it. We began by trying to model the general tendencies of the English landscape towards promoting or inhibiting travel. First, we considered the costs associated with going uphill or downhill. As I just stated, this is the most common type of cost surface analysis. As I said, most people use slope for this, but most people are studying much smaller areas than the whole of England. In order to keep model runtimes down to a reasonable level, the elevation model I used was quite coarsely grained, so the pixels were large. So using slope would have been fairly meaningless, as it would have been very much averaged out. Therefore, we decided to just use a simple sort of 8-fold classification using Wilson's terrain ruggedness index, which is just a very simple measure of terrain roughness. Basically, the average difference in elevation between a pixel and all of its 8 neighbors. So in this model, flat and shallow sloping surfaces would be scored a value of 1, moving on through greater degrees of ruggedness up to a maximum cost of 8 for the most rugged areas of England. And the terrain ruggedness is the grayscale map on the left. And then on the right is the cumulative cost surface produced using the cost allocation shown effectively on the left, but normalized using the previously mentioned flat cost surface. On this map, areas that are red are more rugged and so harder to traverse in terms of energy cost, whereas blue areas are less rugged and thus easier to traverse in terms of energy cost. However, other factors also affect the ease or difficulty of travelling across the landscape. One of those that we tried to model was the wetness of the landscape, as wet conditions generally make travel more onerous, especially when you're trying to move wheeled vehicles over unpaved terrain. This model, which is again the small map on the left, was based on a mixture of modern precipitation data, modern soil wetness data, and modelled hydrological flow accumulation based upon the digital elevation model. This was then again reclassified to produce a cost allocation, with wet areas being higher cost than drier areas, and the travel difficulty model that you can see on the right produced. Again, red is high cost, blue is low cost. The pattern isn't dissimilar to the previous model, albeit it shows sort of lower cost in the Wessex region and higher cost in the southwest in particular. As a slightly less mechanistic variable, we also tried to model visual openness of the landscape and use this to produce a travel model. The assumption behind this was that being able to see a long way across the landscape helps with route finding and with hazard assessment. So visually open landscapes were given a low cost and less open landscapes given a high cost. And again, the visibility models on the left and the travel model is on the right. This assumes that travellers didn't want to hide from anyone else who was around, so can be considered a travel model for those conducting legitimate business. One could, of course, also create an opposite model for those who wish to sneak around in the landscape. The results of this exercise contrast with the previous two models, as the areas of Eastern England that were relatively low cost on the other models are of much higher cost here, whereas the upland areas are generally of lower cost, as one can generally see much further from higher elevations than from when one is on the plain. There is an argument that people have made to me that people walking in fen landscapes are themselves more visually prominent than people walking in hill valleys, as they protrude above the horizon. But this generally doesn't necessarily aid navigation unless there are very tall mileposts or similar that are provided, or there's a lot of traffic on the route you're trying to follow. So I think for this specific purpose, we can ignore that visual prominence element. So finally, for this landscape-based modelling, we produced a composite model using the previous three measures together. The first, the terrain ruggedness index model, was double weighted to make it dominant, as that's the most conventional and least controversial of the three models produced. And the end result is the map shown on screen. This model makes sense intuitively, at least to me, with the wet and rugged landscapes of Western England appearing much harder to navigate than the drier and flatter landscapes of Eastern England. I particularly want you to note the corridor running between the home counties and Yorkshire, as we will see this feature again in the archaeological models that are going to follow. This contrast between upland and lowland England was a feature we saw in many of our analyses, both archaeological and non-archaeological. The point of this attempt to classify the accessibility to movement of the English landscape was then to compare the results to models based on archaeological data, which is what we did next. In this element of the work, we were inspired by a 2016 paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science by Hector Arengo and Alex Levada, in which they attempted to fill in gaps in the British Roman road network using the density of archaeological sites as a guide to where the road should be. They were doing this in order to conduct network analysis on the trade of exotic plant material in Roman Britain, as network analysis works best, obviously, when a network is complete. What we did was we took on this idea that density of archaeological material can suggest routeways through the landscape, and we decided to try modelling movement in a similar way to the previous models, but using archaeological data to define the cost allocation. Obviously, this relies on some pretty large leaps of faith. For a start, the density of archaeology as recovered in the modern day does not have a straightforward relationship to the density of archaeology that would have existed in the past, as different amounts of fieldwork take place in different areas of the country. This is especially the case for the great mass of post-1990 fieldwork conducted in advance of development, as development is not evenly distributed across England. Secondly, this modelling also relies on the rather bold assumption that more archaeological evidence correlates to greater connectivity and movement of material and people in the past. As more evidence suggests to us, more settled landscapes through which travel should be easier to arrange and arguably safer. Clearly, this is a pretty big assumption to make, but I do think it's one that can be supported. Therefore, we next made similar cumulative cost surface models for each of our major time periods: the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Roman, and the early medieval, using the density of archaeological data for each time period within our 1 by 1 kilometre grid squares for the cost allocation. I'm not going to show the Bronze Age model today, as you're the Roman Roads Research Association, but you can find it in the monograph if you're interested. So the map on screen shows the Roman model. Again, red is high travel cost, blue is low. I was really rather enamored with this model when it first came up on the screen, as I think it turned out really quite pretty. It's probably my favourite map of all the many maps we've got in both of our books. The first thing that really strikes me looking at it is the clear appearance of the road network as areas of lower travel cost, alongside some of the river valleys, particularly in the northwest. One would expect the roads to show up as they were included in the archaeological density and the input data, but they're only one element of the data set used, so they shouldn't be completely dominant. The second thing that strikes me is the similarity to the terrain-based model we were just looking at. Note again, and I put this arrow in exactly the same place, the appearance of this corridor from the home counties to Yorkshire. Next, I want to briefly switch back and look at the Iron Age model. The pattern is more smooth than the Roman model, partly due to the lack of roads in the input data, but I think one can also sense in this the presence of some of the later Roman roads in this model too, especially in the southeast. Again, this sort of Ermine Street A1 corridor appears. Clearly that area has been an axis of communication for a long time, as it remains to this day, albeit often now overshadowed by the M1 motorway, which is further to the west. The final model I want to show you is for the early medieval period. Again, I think you can see a sense of some of the Roman roads in this model. And as with the Iron Age, the Roman roads weren't included in the input data for the model, so any appearances would suggest a genuine archaeological pattern. Again, we see the same corridor in this image. The most notable element of this model is probably how it shows the lowest travel cost values in East Anglia, which was the heartland of much early medieval archaeology and the probable entry point for the majority of Anglo-Saxon migrants. Cornwall also shows very low travel costs, but this is at least partly a factor of the willingness of Cornish local authority archaeologists to recognise longer continuity of Roman period sites into the post-Roman period. So often if they've got a Roman site, they'll sort of half assume, half know that, that it extends into the later period, so it will become an early medieval site as well. We then compared these models to the known communication networks existing in each period, and for the Roman and early medieval periods to the major towns. So the Roman model is on the left, and the early medieval model is on the right. The Roman model makes a lot of sense when compared to the roads and the towns, with roads within corridors of connectivity and towns surrounded by areas of higher connectivity. The early medieval model also shows the influence of the Roman roads on connectivity in southern and eastern England, but much less so in the northwest. The towns make less sense on this model, particularly those along the south coast, but then they may well have been served more by maritime than by land-based traffic. Plus, some of these towns may not have come into being until later in the period. We then made statistical comparisons between the terrain-derived travel model, so the one that was 2 TRI plus wetness plus visibility, and the archaeologically derived period models. These graphs, which I term murmuration graphs for hopefully obvious reasons, show a black dot for each grid square, plotted according to their value on the terrain model on the y-axis and the period models on each x-axis. The red line is a linear correlation. The closer it is to a 45-degree angle, the stronger the degree of correlation between the two measurements. The really striking thing here is the high degree of correlation between the terrain model and the models for the Iron Age and Roman periods. The values are 0.577 and 0.569 for each, and these are R2 values, which suggests that this relationship is quite significant, representing more than half of the variation within the data sets. There is a lower degree of correlation with the early medieval model, 0.395, and very little correlation with the Bronze Age model that I didn't show you. So this suggests that movement and connectivity in the Iron Age periods had a reasonably strong relationship to the affordances provided by the English landscape that make travel easier in particular areas. I would say that the layman tends to think of travel in the Roman period as all about straight line roads that were imposed on the landscape, ignoring the contouring of terrain, but the situation was clearly not as straightforward as that. Travel and communication in the Roman period and in the Iron Age does actually appear to have followed on the whole the line of least resistance on a broad brush level. Just as a minor point, if we look at the Roman road network by itself, we can again see the importance of that corridor along the line of Ermine Street and modern A1, reflected also in the Antonine itineraries, which are plotted here as a network in orange. The Roman period is likely unique within the EngLaId timeframe for having had maps and itineraries to aid travellers, although how widespread these were is hard to say. Another way in which we examine movement in the past was through horse equipment recorded by the PAS, the Portable Antiquities Scheme. Prehistoric horse equipment is plotted on the left-hand map against the three major ridgeway networks of prehistoric England. Clearly, there's no strong correlation between the two, but horse equipment does appear to be mostly located in areas calculated as being of higher connectivity in our Iron Age model, which is plotted in the background. For the Roman period on the right, there's a stronger correlation between horse equipment and the contemporary road network. And again, the horse equipment is mostly confined to areas of higher connectivity in the model. However, distributions produced solely from PAS data are intrinsically biased towards the areas of the country where more metal detecting takes place, which tends to be the south and the east. Much of the northwest is national parks where metal detecting is illegal, and finds from excavations such as the many along Hadrian's Wall, where we know there were a lot of horsemen, do not tend to be entered into the PAS. As such, the relationship between these distributions and the travel models probably isn't as strong as one might assume just from looking at the map. We also wanted to look at river crossings. So we map these in two ways, using records for bridges and so on in our database, and through an intersection operation between the Roman roads and the modern major watercourses defined by the Ordnance Survey. So that basically generates a dot where two lines cross. I don't expect you to really be able to read very clearly the maps on screen, but the larger purple points are the intersections and the smaller ones are 3-kilometre hexagons containing records of bridges. The left-hand map is plotted over the travel model and the right-hand map over the river network. So there were 566 locations where Roman roads crossed rivers, modern major watercourses, of which only 58 had an archaeological record of a bridge within 500 metres. Overall, there were 199 records for Roman river crossings in our archaeological database, but as I just said, most of these were not coincident with where one would expect these major river crossings to be. Many of these crossings could, of course, have been fords, but it's also probably the case that many more Roman bridges either remain to be discovered or have been destroyed completely, particularly where the roads still exist today. The photo, by the way, is Trajan's Bridge at Chaves in northern Portugal. So, because it's better preserved than any Roman bridges I've ever seen in Britain, but I'm willing to be educated. We also wanted to look briefly at the survival of Roman roads into the early medieval period. So the black roads on this map are those that have been suggested to have survived based on place name evidence, according to this book that I've listed on the slide by Cole. We then added to these, with the additions plotted in red, by comparing the Roman road network to the modern road network and keeping those Roman roads that were close to and on a similar alignment to modern roads, as it seems reasonable to argue that Roman roads preserved in the modern day ought to also have been preserved in intervening periods. This map also shows early medieval horse equipment, which I think you can argue also appears to have a reasonably strong visual correlation to surviving Roman roads, particularly in the eastern half of the country. So there's just a couple of last things I wanted to talk about. So I think I've been a bit faster than expected, but that's all right. One is the clear importance of rivers to movement in the past. So the map on screen is a redraft of one published by John Blair, in which he tried to define on a sort of ad hoc basis the major corridors of movement through early medieval England. Blair clearly sees rivers as being key travel arteries through England at that time. And we know that from how Vikings travelled. In the Roman period, direct archaeological evidence for river transport is sparsely distributed across England. In our database, for the Roman period, there were 34 records for watercraft and 105 records of port and quay type structures. The Thames and the Kent coast seem to feature the greatest amount of evidence, probably due to being the end of the primary access of cross-channel communication in this period. One should also not forget about the unit of bargemen known to have been present in South Shields on Tyneside, which helps to suggest that water-based transport must have been more important in the Roman period than the scant surviving archaeological evidence can attest, within England at least. Finally, I just wanted to touch briefly upon a piece of work we've conducted since the end of EngLaId. The model on screen is an attempt to model the complexity of Roman archaeology across England using the England database by comparing the distribution against a series of potential explanatory variables using a random forest regression analysis. Explanatory variables included things like excavation density, soil type, that sort of thing. And by complexity, I mean the number of different site types per unit area. The concept of this is to try to predict areas where we might expect more Roman archaeology to be one day discovered, maybe also to define areas where there's less likelihood of discovering complex sites or lots of sites. hopefully you can see how the roads really pop out of this model, particularly in the less dense areas. This graph shows the importance ranking of the explanatory variables. The highest value is for density of excavations, unsurprisingly, but the second highest value is proximity to Roman roads, as circled in red. This suggests that the presence of a Roman road is a very good predictor of the presence of further Roman archaeological remains. Obviously, this isn't a surprising result, but it's one that is useful to be able to demonstrate statistically. So this slide just gives a final plug for our monograph, which you should be able to get a discount on using the code at the bottom on the screen if you want to buy the book. As I said at the start, the monograph is also available on Oxford Scholarship Online if you have access to that through an institution or similar. And I've also uploaded a PDF of the figures prior to the published edits to our blog, as some people have complained that the maps in the book are too small to read. And again, I'd remind you that you can download a PDF of the atlas for free from the ArchaeoPress online shop. So thank you again for the invite. I also need to thank all of the people who provided data and advice to the project and the rest of the project team. The links on screen point to our project blog, that's the WordPress link, which is no longer frequently updated now the project's over, but which contains a wealth of material generated through the lifetime of the project. And the second link is the WebGIS, where you can explore some of our data online, basically the squares and the hexagons and some of the potential explanatory data sets are also in there. And that's it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Chris, for that. That really demonstrates just some of the stuff that we can do with modern technology for processing data.
Yeah, sorry if it was a bit technical.
Well, I think that's good for us sometimes. We've got a couple of questions here, and I think they relate us. Some of my own thoughts did to the way you set up the criteria. This one is from Paul Morris, Mannisher. Is the visibility criterion that you've used, is that based on topography? Is it based on modern tree cover? Because if it is, how would that, Roman tree cover was likely to be denser than it is now?
Yes, that is purely based on topography, because obviously that's, particularly on that sort of scale, that's all we can really do. So you can it's basically similar to the travel models. You make what's called a view shed, which is the visibility from a point, the area you can see from a point based on the surface around. And basically, I tried to construct a sort of everywhere to everywhere total view shed, which is just, particularly in the computer I was using, impossible basically. So basically the model is you take peaks and you take pits and you define view sheds for all of those and then add them together, and then you get a sort of cumulative visual openness measure. And obviously it's just based on topography, so yes, there is considerable issues around, tree cover and all buildings and everything else. None of that is in that. It's quite a blunt instrument, but it's the best one can do at this sort of scale, because modeling tree cover in the past is difficult enough on a site level, let alone for the whole country.
Well, again, from Paul Morris, incidentally, he said, thank you for a very interesting and instructive presentation. But he wondered whether any similar exercise was being undertaken, could be undertaken in Scotland. It says, for example, the Roman road analysis in medieval modern context includes documented evidence of Edward's invasion of Scotland in the 14th century along roads to central Scotland, particularly near Stirling.
I'm not doing that. I'm sure that I have heard about a project doing the border region in the Roman period along similar lines to EngLaId, which was what's his name? Dave, the aerial archaeologist. his name's gone out of my head, but there's he works for the Scottish environment people. Yeah, it'll come to me. But yeah, I mean, I think EngLaId was very much a sort of a project that was, we viewed our project as sort of testing things and doing sort of challenging people in a way to sort of see what you can do with this kind of data sets and these kind of analyses. And we're quite happy for people to like take them on, do things further, and we're quite happy for people to tell us we were wrong. You know, I mean, we're not precious about it. So yeah, I think yeah, in some ways it was a demonstration of what you could do, and it would be interesting if people tried to do it for different time periods and for different subsets of data, for sure.
Thank you. And then from Joseph Lewis. Hi, Chris, great presentation. I'm interested in the data on the Roman bridges and forwards. Is that available online to download? Is it public data?
Basically, the synthetic data sets that I talked about, the spatial binning stuff, that is on our website, on the web gist I linked in the last slide. It is feasible to download that, but like I say, there weren't actually that many bridges in that. The points, the intersection points between roads and rivers, I haven't put online anywhere. I could, if someone wants it, I can email them the shapefile. That's easy enough, assuming they have access to GIS software. I'm quite happy to do that, because it's just the collision between two relatively publicly available data sets. Certainly the major watercourses you can download from the OS Open Data. And the roads I used were Historic England's ones, but there are other people who've made Roman roads available online, and as I'm sure you're aware, in a GIS format, like Mike Bishop has, and I think other people. So it would be simple enough to reconstruct as well if you know how to use GIS at least.
Well, not everyone does.
No, of course they don't. No. But then, you know, the data set is the collision, the intersection data set is a GIS data set. So I'm not quite sure what you would do with it if you couldn't use it in GIS. I suppose you could do it as a spreadsheet, but yeah, don't know.
We've got one from John Adams here asking, could there be any link to drovers' roads when there was a need to move cattle, allowing for pasture and fording? Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure all of you have ideas about what Roman roads were used for. I mean, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on that. I think the areas that we do see higher connectivity, or we think we can argue for higher connectivity, then yeah, there's probably definitely movement of animals through those areas too, particularly during time periods where animals were moving a long distance, which we know. I mean, it certainly happened in the Neolithic, and it certainly happened in the Roman period. Presumably it happened at times in between. You know, because you can see that sometimes from the Strontium data. Like they found pigs at Stonehenge from miles and miles away, haven't they? But you know, I think it was pigs, but yeah.
Thank you. And then from Chris Hudson, again, huge thanks, Chris. Very valuable data collection, fascinating analysis, and lots to get the brain whirring. And then he says, there's an interesting military strategy game, the operational art of war. Seriously models least cost analysis for supply movement. And in that, there's a huge difference in the penetrability of terrain for road-based and pack horse or walking. Have you any thoughts on that? Well, the difference that road makes, I suppose.
Again, you know, I'm not really an expert in how animals and humans move differently in the landscape. So yeah,
A hard one to deal with, presumably.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, there's what, Diocletian's price index that has some information on those sort of things, but Yeah, I assume to some degree that's what the computer game is based on, because that's what a lot. There's a website where you can calculate travel times across the Roman world,
Right.
and that's mostly based on Diocletian Price Edict, I think. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but I can find out.
And then we have from Roman Road Research Association. Right, this one close to home. Right, I was a little surprised to see your map showing so few Roman roads still in use. Wonder how the data was determined, since many Roman roads that do have Roman antecedents weren't marked in red on your map. For example, the A66 and parts of the A1.
Well, if they were on there in black, then that's because they would already been defined. The red were just the additions. So the black roads on the map were the ones that were defined by place names, and then I tried to add in the other ones in red. I mean, it was an automated analysis, so clearly some things will slip between the gaps. Yeah, so yeah, I may have missed some things because I was trying to. There was a proximity measure between the road defined by Historic England and the roads defined by the OS, and then I tried to say that they were within a certain bearing of each other. So yeah, clearly if there are inconsistencies between those two data sets, then they won't come through. I should have said probably that with the Roman roads that I was plotting based on the Historic England data, I did cut out a lot of the ones that were described as supposed Roman road or possible Roman road, because I wanted to stick with the more reliable ones. So I think a lot of those sort of Via Torres ones probably disappeared. And you know, people can have opinions on that or not, I don't mind.
Then we've got one from Bev, that'll be Bev not. He said, I didn't understand the words of the disability data. Actually, I missed that one myself.
Oh, visibility. That would have been visibility.
Oh, visibility. Oh,
yeah. Sorry.
Yes,
I just came out wrong.
Yes, right.
Can I just say, sorry, it was meant to be the value of visibility data. Why the visibility data? Thanks.
Oh, okay. As I said, we were just experimenting with things. I feel my argument was that visibility is important when you're navigating a landscape, particularly if you don't have a road or path to follow, because you need to see where you're going. That's the basis of the argument. I mean, you can argue with me if you don't think that's important or not. So my argument was that it's easier to navigate in landscapes where you can see a long way, so that aids travel and makes movement easier. It's as simple as that, really.
No, it's not relevant to Roman roads, though.
Well, no, but I mean, yes, I'm talking to the Roman Roads Association, but I wasn't talking about just Roman roads. I was talking about movement.
Thank you. Right. Thank you.
One from Tim here. It says he's having trouble finding the PDF download.
Yeah, I put the link in the chat. I saw that.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Excellent. Right. So that should be available for people to see.
And a couple of people have put the Orbis link, which is the thing I couldn't remember the name of.
I was interested in how you chose your areas of data. Clearly, you've got to start somewhere, but you were talking about why you chose visibility and so on. But you included ruggedness, but you didn't go for forest. But maybe that's because we don't have information.
Yeah, exactly. Forest it's difficult. I mean, it's pollen data, but pollen data is hard to interpret. And you know, it wasn't collated at the time. Some of it's been collated since. The Fields of Britannia project did that for some areas of England for the Roman and early medieval period. But yeah, going from pollen to where there are actually trees on the ground is hard. And yeah, I mean, those are things, I mean, I don't want to say low-hanging fruit, because they weren't low-hanging fruit, because some of these things were quite hard.
It sounds very
but
challenging.
you know, we're doing things that are possible to do within
Yeah.
a sort of desk-based analysis with data sets that exist. I mean, there are things that clearly we couldn't do.
Do you think there was any serious skew placed on things by the sort of things you talked about, which is more metal detecting in the southeast, more development in the lowland areas in the southeast? How far do you think that might have skewed results, or not significantly?
I think it does. It definitely has an effect. I mean, we tried to model some of these factors. I mean, there's a whole chapter in both books on those, on how we tried to model some of these. We call them affordances, but you don't need to really go along with that. But basically, the things that potentially spatially bias the data sets. So yeah, it definitely has an effect. Quantifying that effect, I mean, you can do it to some extent, but it's not completely straightforward. If you're looking at, if you compare two different types of sites, and you plot these models of potential, and then you say so, for example, if you compare Iron Age hill forts, they tend to occur in areas of much lower potential because they're big and they're obvious, whereas things like, say, early medieval Grubenheiser, because they require excavation normally to be found, they might not even show up in geophysics. They tend to score much higher on these measures. It's just really difficult to say.
Yes,
you just have to do what you can with the data that you have, don't you?
Yeah. I've got one here from Paul and Alison saying the data set analysis is a great tool and has great potential. They've wondered about including any available time period data such that by running it by time through a time interval, a settlement pattern change could be seen. Potentially really interesting for general Roman scholarship and Neolithic settlement and so on.
Yes, I mean, doing that sort of thing was the kind of thing that I was trying to do in my PhD 15 years ago. So yeah, it's certainly feasible to do that sort of thing. It's not particularly easy with this data set because the dating evidence is very varied in terms of how precise things are and how, because a lot of things are just recorded by broad time periods. So, you know, for our data set, we couldn't really do anything that was very temporally precise, other than with the portable antiquity scheme, because that's the one place where like everything has a start and an end date, and you can be reasonably confident that they're precise. But again, there it's the start and the end date represents a period during which that particular type of thing was made. It doesn't necessarily represent the time when this thing went into the ground or when this thing was made specifically. So that's all like, yeah, it's probability. It gets complicated statistically.
Can I just ask you, right at the start, you were talking about the sheer mass of data that's out there and the difficulties of fitting it together. Mm-hmm. And some of it perhaps more accessible for you than others. How much of that paper analysis, the paper records that you've been talking about with developers and so on, how much of that were you able to use? You may have said, but
I mean, yes, I was contrasting between our project that basically took the high level data, which is basically just what the local authorities say is when and where, and what various other national and sort of some other small data sets say is when and where. And then the real potential of this sort of synthetic analysis for post-1990 data is at that sort of low level with all of those PDFs. I mean, there's thousands of PDFs on the ADS, on the Grey Literature Library, but it's just because currently the only way to extract anything from that is manually by reading things and writing things down and entering things into databases. It's an unimaginable task to try and do it for everything. So yeah, we did very little of that. But that's Roman rural settlement projects that I talked about as well as a sort of contrast. They did a lot of that, but it just produces it's things that it's just working on even though it's the same amount of time being put in and the same number of people, it just, well, probably they put in more time if anything, because they probably worked harder than we did, because they were very
I'm sure
but you know, they were three of them. They're all very bright, hard-working lads, and they managed to go through 4,000 odd reports, or at least in terms of collating data, 4,000 odd sites basically, and you know, that's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more out there.
I think we just got one last question from Penny Jackson, who describes the hill as being deep in your red zone, right? In your red zone in Cumbria on both models. But she said, I know there are some Roman roads through these high cost areas. Why, do you think, this could be a challenge for you, but why do you think they went into these difficult areas at all? And do you think there's much hope for finding Roman activity in the red areas where very little has been found so far?
I think why they went into the areas, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I imagine it's mostly military reasons. Whether there's potential for more Roman archaeology to be found there, again, it depends. And clearly there are parts of the country where there is less visible results of human activity went into the ground. I don't think we would argue that necessarily there were less people, or even necessarily that they were less wealthy in some ways, but they're just doing things that aren't as archaeologically visible as the people who were living in the south and the east, where everything was much more settled down and materially rich. Yeah, and I mean, you know, who knows what could happen in the future. I mean, maybe people will invent something that shows up all the cattle poaching in the past where all the cattle went and all that sort of thing, but who knows. I mean, that's
maybe just to round off, Chris, you can say, do you feel that what you've been doing here is a kind of the end result as far as it's possible to achieve something from this, or do you feel this is just the start of what can be done in the future?
Yeah. This is, I mean, we were very much in some ways a sort of pilot to see what people can do with this sort of data and what potentials there are, like I say, and we'd love to see people building on doing similar things in the future. You know, if people can get, I mean, there's potential, people always talking for years about data mining into these PDF reports and things using natural language processing and AI, you know, if you can get a computer that can go through and read all of these reports and turn them into usable data, then that would be an epic project. But it's one of those things that's always on the horizon, like nuclear fusion power. So yeah, I mean, it would be great to see people do similar things. Yeah, or even, yeah, you know, I'd love it if someone went out and did the same project and found completely different things, told us we were wrong. It's great. Who cares? It'd be good.
Well, I think that's a good place to round off, and I see the number of people writing and saying how much they appreciate everything this evening, and and you've given us an insight into something for many of us is a really new area.
Yeah. I was looking at your other talks, and I could see that what I was talking about was quite different than what most people do. But you know, yeah.
Which is great. You know what? That's exactly what we want. It's a mixture of things and an understanding of just from how many different directions people are approaching all these questions. And the kind of approach you've been taking is obviously something that we couldn't have done, you know, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and yeah, it's yeah. Hopefully, it's the start of something rather than drawing a line under 30 years of development. I think hopefully it's, yeah. Who knows?
So on behalf of us all, and I've seen some more now, so very interesting, Chris, thank you very much.
Yes, I can see that.
So on. So many thanks to you, and thanks for everyone who's been tuning in this evening, and we'll end the call here. Thank you to Chris, thank you to everyone. Good night from the Triple RI.
Thank you.